Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's briefing on the unfinished Arab Spring with Fatima El-Issawi and Francesco Cavatorta. I hope I pronounced those correctly. We're very pleased to be doing yet another sort of Caabu online briefing. We've done several others so far, and we are hoping to do many more. We have a couple coming up, actually, one with Hanan Ashrawi next week, which we'll send details of to you all, and one on Nawal al-Maghafi. If you could make sure that the audio is switched off, that would be great. Both the speakers will speak for about roughly 10 minutes each, which will be followed by a Q&A. Please put any questions that you have into the chat, and we will aim to get through as many of them as we can. I hope you'll have lots of questions, and we'll be wanting to ask them many things. Just sort of by way of introduction, one second. By way of introduction, so Fatima El-Issawi is a reader in journalism and media studies at the University of Essex. Her research focuses on the intersection between media, politics and conflicts in transitional contexts to democracy in North Africa. She is a principal investigator for the research project Media and Transitions to Democracy, Journalistic Practices in Communicating Conflicts, the Arab Spring, which was funded by the British Academy Sustainable Development Programme, looking at the media's impact on communicating political conflicts in post-uprisings in North Africa. Her expertise crosses journalism, public communication, policy and academia, and she has over 15 years of experience as international correspondent in conflict zones in the MENA region. She's the author of Arab National Media and Political Change, investigating the complex intersections between traditional journalists and politics and uncertain times of transitions to democracy in the Arab region. And also we have Francesco Cavatorta, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Centre Interdisciplinaire de Recherche sur l'Afrique et le Moyen-Orient at Laval University, Quebec, Canada. His research focuses on the dynamics of authoritarianism and democratization in the Middle East and North Africa. His current research projects deal with party politics, the role of political parties in the region, and he has published over 60 journal articles and 13 books. We're also very, very pleased that we have Gingko Library with us, and they'll be able to send out details in the chat of how you can purchase the book. I know there is a discount of 30% going today as well. So, Fatima, if we can start with you. Thank you both very much for joining us, and thank you all for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Caabu, for this brilliant opportunity. Especially today, I just received the book. A very beautiful production. Thank you, Gingko, for this, for their support, and thanks for our contributor. As you explained, this book is part of a wider project. It's an empirical research project funded by the British Academy, looking at the intersection between the news media and political change in the context of uprising, our movement for change in North Africa. Our idea was based on the fact that the journalistic practice in communicating the conflict or struggles around this change is a very important and active agent in shaping the dynamics of this movement, and sometimes in some contexts, the outcome of this movement, whether facilitating a democratic change or hindering it. And the book reflects this vision of the project, and we aim to provide an original understanding of these uprisings as movement of change, a kind of novel interpretation of them, by taking the debate on this movement a bit away from the extensive focus on institutional change taking place in mainstream politics, political parties, elections, and so on, and also from macro level analysis, comparison at a regional level. Not that we think that these are not important, but we think they are not sufficient to understand the complexities and the significance of these movements. So the contribution of the book is twofold. First, we try to give a much deserved attention to the many voices of change that were always audible and active and present on the margins, but did not attract such attention in academic and policy analysis. We try to unpack the microdynamics of change as it takes place below the radar, on the margin, as a complex movement of struggle between structure and human agency. And we believe, as very well demonstrated in this book, that this practice of dissent remains strong below the surface in the most repressed conditions and areas, but also even in democratic or more democratic situations such as in Tunisia. Secondly, the book provides a deep understanding of local and national contexts and legacies brought by experts who come from the region, whether they live in the region or live in the West and study it, and who may not be published in English language. So we could transmit their sophisticated knowledge and expertise of the region to a Western audience, along with esteemed colleagues coming from Western universities. Our contributors are not only scholars, but also they come from media expertise and policy making in media and politics. As well highlighted in the title of the book, we understand those movements to be unfinished issue, an unfinished story. Well, as we can see, they are unpredictable, they take longer than was expected in the start, and they cannot be judged by their immediate result by traditional paradigms of democratization with a fall of regime and a building of a new structure in Tunisia, or resilient autocracy with the current wave of counter-revolutions in the area, an explosion of violence, such the case of Egypt and Syria. As opposed to seeing this movement as a limited time event, we consider them as a process that brought many changes that are still in the making in Arab societies and modified the relationship between citizens and the power, even with the return of the authoritarian rule and the explosion of violence in the region. And actually, while we were finishing the production, the drafting of this volume, we were working on it, powerful new movement of dissent erupted in many different countries that we never expected something like this can happen in Iraq, in Algeria, in Sudan, in Lebanon, end of 2019, displaying also innovative forms of rebellion, whether online and offline, and high level of resilience, again confirming that we cannot talk about start date and end date of this movement. So based on these objectives and goals, the book is formed of two parts. The first part gives voice to national dynamics and legacies to try to dissect the trajectories of change and continuity in a number of Arab countries, focusing on national specificities in these countries and trying to depict the major forces pushing for change or either pushing and working for maintaining the status quo. In the second part, we look at specific policy area or field or sectors that also did not attract lots of attention in the analysis or cannot be understood and captured by macro level analysis at regional level. For example, we look at media and youth, entrepreneurship in media, new form in media, gender, feminist group and agency in their struggle with a conservative system, even in the case of the secular Tunisia, alternative politics, creating a new style of politics, and the role of civil society group and how they acted as a guardian of change in some places and did not work the same in other places. So we are very much grateful for our contributors, their time and dedication and their expertise. The extremely brilliant team of Gingko, Barbara, she's with us today, but also Aida Bahrami was really amazing in supporting us. Mainly, we want to say that this book celebrates and give weight to the human agency and its disruptive power that contradict an idea and assumption of a passive Arab public sphere, even in a situation where it is co-opted or silenced through counter-revolution or a different clever way of co-optation. And here I want, I think, to give time and place. We move to Francesco would talk in maybe in more detail about some trends that were presented in the book.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Caabu, of course, for hosting this online book launch, and thanks very much to all the participants. I'm gonna take up from where Fatima left off and maybe discuss a few of the main findings that the contributors to the book had to offer in their studies. The first important one, I think, is that we all wanted to kind of move away, as Fatima said, from institutions and political parties and big discussions on regime change or the absence of regime change. And we wanted to concentrate a bit more on, let's say, microdynamics of activism, of protest, of what happens in wider society and what is happening in wider society and the transformations that have taken place. There are actually a number of findings that cut across the different chapters. Then if we have questions on individual chapters, we can certainly try to answer them. But what I wanted to do is just maybe go over some of the trends that you can see across the chapters. The first one, which is not necessarily a novelty, but it's often forgotten when we discuss politics in terms of institutional change or the absence of institutional change, that a lot of the chapters underline that protests is now the new politics. That in fact, the vast majority of the activism taking place is taking place outside institutions, even in countries that have tried to consolidate their democracy, like Tunisia. A lot of the political discussions are taking place outside parliament, outside political parties, and in fact, they tend to take place in wider society under the form of protests. And this is a trend that we can see pretty much across the entire region, and many of the case studies that we looked at in the book do reflect that particular point. Another point I think that it's worth mentioning, it's always interesting, and again, it might not be necessarily new, but it's worth re-emphasizing its importance, is, if you want, the socioeconomic dimension of the protests. We didn't look at the Arab Spring, as the title says, as something that has occurred in late 2010, early 2011, and that simply either failed or succeeded. I think it's very difficult to look at it in such constraining timelines and then decide whether one phenomenon has failed or it has succeeded. I think the implications of what has happened and the changes that have taken place are only maybe now beginning to be kind of teased out, and we can see the long-term consequences of what has happened. And one kind of defining, I suppose, issue that connects the last 10 years of protest in the region has to do with socioeconomic conditions. And most of the authors underline how there is a huge break between let's say, the macroeconomic indicators that were supposed to be good or getting better, and in fact, the micro realities, and therefore the realities of the majority of individuals. So while the country might have grown economically, the vast majority of the population was left behind. So the idea is, in the different chapters, that people, the contributors looked at how this fuels protest, and it fuels a kind of a new type of politics. And we see now, for instance, that it's going beyond the traditional differences that we used to have and we used to analyze politics through in the past. So, for instance, we can see that some of these socioeconomic conditions and the protest and the political protest linked to it are going beyond sectarianism, for instance. That might be the case in Iraq and Lebanon. They also go to a certain extent beyond the traditional cleavage between Islamism and, let's say, secularity or laicite in North Africa. So there is this idea that socioeconomic conditions are actually quite important as a fuel for the protest, and a fuel also to look for a new type of politics, and the institutional representatives of the old type of politics are being increasingly questioned in the way they deal with each other and govern. Another trend that I think is quite important is that, and it's a kind of paradox that it's interesting to examine, and some of our contributors do that, is that there is no hiding the fact that since 2011, 2012, in a lot of countries, we also had some sort of renewed authoritarianism. So authoritarianism has also changed in a way in attempts to control society and to control the politics of protest. But the reality is that in spite this kind of reassertion of authoritarian rule, protests have kept going. This is true in Egypt. This is true in Morocco, for instance, two of our case studies in the book, and the contributors make that quite clear in the sense that there is, again, politics at the institutional level in a way, with governments trying to reassert their authority and close down space for society, notably in Egypt, for instance. And then this has not stopped, though. It has not prevented people from finding new forms of protest. Some of them online, some of them offline, some of them actually combine kind of both, as the protest in Morocco, for instance, usually highlight that there's a kind of an immediate connection between the offline mobilization and an online mobilization. So that's also another aspect that is quite interesting, and we can see and trace across different countries and across the last 10 years. And finally, sorry, there's also another point that emerged, and I think maybe the fourth important one, is a reappropriation of the concept of citizenship on the part of individuals and communities across the entire region. The idea that full citizenship is not something that is simply granted from the top down, but it's something that needs to be reappropriated, and it is usually reappropriated through protest and participation and activism. So the idea that the active citizen has to reaffirm his centrality in what the government does and in policy making. So I think that these two trends are quite important. They do speak to a change that has taken place in across the region, across the Arab world, and I think the implication of these four trends are not finished. I mean, again, I think we take kind of Asef Bayat's point on board when he says that it's way too early to decide what the real consequences of the Arab uprisings are. We cannot simply limit ourselves to kind of look at the period between 2010, 2013, or 2014, and then say, well, this uprisings finished here. That's it. I think that the consequences and implications are much more long term, and I think all the contributors in the book make that quite clear through their analysis. I would stop here because maybe I think, well, for everybody, actually even without the maybe, definitely for everybody, it might be more interesting to ask questions and be able to ask maybe more specific questions about the book, the contributors, or however you want to ask. So thank you very much for listening to me for the last 10 minutes. I think in conjunction with Fatima, we will decide who answers what, I suppose. So I leave the mic to Joseph, and I'll mute mine now.
Thank you, Fatima, and thank you, Francesco, for all your comments, and I hope there'll be lots of questions. We had a couple come through already. Sorry, I'm being by myself. My words struggle sometimes, but a question from me actually is that just because of what is happening at the moment with coronavirus, how are you seeing in the last couple of months in, say, places like Lebanon, for example, or elsewhere, Morocco. Are there any significant ways in which people, I suppose, are adapting to the current situation and using that in terms of a lot of the issues that you discuss?
Actually, we can see that the protest in Lebanon is back. They are trying to adapt to the situation of coronavirus, but in some of the pockets where poverty is very high, what we hear from people talking to media is that actually we don't care about corona because we don't have enough money to buy a mask, but also we are more afraid of poverty and our future in this, failing situation, economic situation in Lebanon, rather than the coronavirus. So, I think the situation in Lebanon is quite special given the financial and economic situation. But I think in most of other places as well, economic pressure and problems were not totally, silenced by the threat of corona. Despite the fact that in Tunisia or in Lebanon, we see government responding to the threat of corona in much more efficient ways than it is in a more democratic and wealthy places.
Thank you very much. Anything else to add, Francesco, or is that covered? No. We had a question actually from Miriam Salamakar. Miriam, would you like to ask your question? Is she there? Anyway, she asked about how do you capture such microdynamics outside of institutions?
Yeah, well, the vast majority of our contributors have actually conducted empirical fieldwork in order to, for instance, look at specific groups that are involved in this kind of micro protest and micro dynamics. I'll give a couple of examples. Maybe in the chapter on Tunisia, Tunisian women's activism, Alessandra Bonci, one of the contributors, has been spending now the last 2 years working with Salafi women, so women involved in kind of the promotion of a more conservative view of Islam. And now these women interact with groups or don't interact with groups that are, let's say, more secular and don't necessarily see Salafi women in a good light. So the idea is that you can capture these dynamics by actually being there and kind of going through the almost ethnographic fieldwork that is necessary to capture these microdynamics over the longer term. And her chapter is in fact about the attempt to reappropriate citizenship and to discuss issues linked to citizenship regarding the reform of the inheritance law and discussions about the family code more broadly in the new democratic Tunisia. The chapter on Morocco as well focuses a lot on the Rif Iraq, on the movement, on the protest movement in the Rif. And so we have the particular scholar is in Morocco and has the possibility to conduct this fieldwork in that particular way. This comes through, of course, more in the second part of the book than in the first part of the book, as Fatima mentioned. But that is the idea. So that's how we tried to look at these microdynamics, and that is the reason why we also wanted to have a lot of local researchers involved in this kind of academic production, because sometimes we felt that, and I'll be the first to admit, of course, that sometimes we tend to privilege, external views, or let's say white men describing what is going on in the Arab world. That's not necessarily always a good thing. So I think involving local researchers with their perspectives, ideas, and experience, I think it brings out something that is more interesting and more fruitful to debate for everybody. And a lot of the researchers, therefore, have conducted research in the field, as I was saying. I hope that answer the question from Mariam. I think Miriam. Sorry, apologies.
I just want to add something, that this is part of an empirical research project that is completely based on work in the field, focus group, brings researchers from the region, and we don't tend to try to understand these phenomena through survey research, for example. We are not saying that surveys are not important, but we think that our work in the field, also by the help of local researchers, gives a more in-depth understanding of it.
Thank you both very much. And a question from Chris.
Thank you very much, both of you, to Fatima and to Francesco. I wanted to ask, I mean, ever since the protests in 2010-11, I think there's been a running theme of, criticism might be too strong a word, but that one of the reasons the protest didn't sort of manage to have long-lasting impact on the regimes was the lack of an ability to transition from being protest organizations to being real political movements. In the intervening decade or so, do you see a lot of changes in understanding of how, better to do that? And the protests that we've seen recently try to answer that question about how to create political movements, albeit in a very constricted political space under these regimes.
In a way, it might depend might be different from country to country, but the countries that we looked at in the book and what emerges from the findings in the book still see participation in institutional politics. So, for instance, a better transmission belt between the protests and how they could be translated into actual policy-making change at the institutional level, that has not occurred yet. And in particular, and this links to a project I'm working on at the moment on political parties, there is, across all the different countries, very low trust in political parties, very low trust in parliament, very low trust in elected officials, very low trust in the media, the mainstream media. So it means, in a way, that participating in the protest and being active in the protest is also an attempt to find a way to circumvent institutional politics and bring about change differently. But I think the success is limited precisely because that transmission belt is missing. So, for instance, the chapter on protests in North Africa, on alternative politics in North Africa, the author makes it quite clear that the connection between these protests and microdynamics that can be either very local or even national protests find it very hard to connect with institutions, and in particular with political parties. And that includes political parties that are nominally opposition political parties. This is not necessarily a novelty, or it's not necessarily a trait of the Arab world alone. I think that confidence in political parties has been going down pretty much across the world. The Arab world, in this respect, is not much of an exception. In fact, it's not exceptional at all. It just confirms the trend that we see elsewhere. Whether this is a weakness or not, I am not entirely sure. I think it might be in the longer term, but in the short term, I think that the simple act of participating and the simple act of reappropriating, in a way, citizenship is actually quite useful to raise the collective consciousness of ordinary citizens. Fatima, I'm not sure if you want to add something to this.
I just want to add something, because I may understood that, Chris, you were talking also about the new wave of movement in the Arab world. Am I right or wrong in assuming you were talking about it?
Well, I'm talking about the whole period. So yes, obviously that's the latest manifestation, what we saw last year and still going on this year in Lebanon, Algeria. But just really,
I just want to
what
add
the learning process has been.
Yes, I want just to add to what Francesco said, that we are seeing a higher level of resilience in this movement, and a kind of expressions that are a mix of online and offline. So there is less reliance on the online as a way to, power change, or a magic ball that we can use in cyber activism to bring about change. But that, question posed about participation and how they what kind of impact this movement will have on politics, on whether they can be able to change, and how. I mean, these are still early questions, still early to be answered.
Thank you both very much. And now a question on religiosity from Mohammed Amin. Mohammed?
Yes, I'm always very interested in the extent to which people's religious beliefs affect their politics, both at an individual level and even more so in an organizational sense, where you get both in the Arab world, in South Asia, and indeed in North America, very strong political alignments with particular religious groups and what's happening in the Middle East. Obviously, everybody's heard about the Muslim Brotherhood, Hezbollah, Hamas. To what extent are religiously motivated parties and actors in the Middle East increasing in influence or reducing in influence?
Well, I think the question of sectarianism and the rift between secular and Islamist was very much a focus on the beginning of what we call the spring, and most of research and policy try to understand this movement in terms of this division. I think what also Francesco was saying before, that these demands around socioeconomic issues are becoming most important, or most, I mean, they were always important, but most powerful in the expression of these, more powerful in the expression of this movement, as we saw lately in Lebanon, for example, as we saw in Iraq. And in my personal research in Tunisia, I cannot see now the struggles around the building of new institutions and new systems that can be simply defined by the divide between Al-Nahda and the so-called secular groups in Tunisia. And I think it's oversimplification to continue to, try to define, even in the now community of Hezbollah, there are many questions about policies and about its trajectory. The same question for the Muslim Brotherhood, the same question for Al-Nahda. So what we try to say, it's just much more complicated than a simple religious divide between secular and non-secular. I'm not sure whether, Francesco, you approve with me.
I think there might be two ways of looking at it, and I think the book looks only at one way. I think if we can look at it from a party politics perspective, an electoral politics perspective, and in that respect, you have significant differences between countries. So, for instance, in Tunisia, it seems that this religious secular divide at the institutional party politics level and at the electoral level might not matter that much, and that might depend on the fact that Ennahda has been perceived to have governed quite badly when it was in power, either in the Troika or the subsequent government. So for instance, if one remembers their share of the vote in 2011, it was about 38%. It is now, I think, barely 17%. So that, I think, it's an indication that most voters will judge a political party on performance rather than on ideology, let's say, or simply I will vote for you because because I believe that you are a good Muslim or the true Muslim or whatever. No, in fact, I'll vote for you again if you deliver. If you don't deliver, I'm either not going to vote or I'm going to vote for somebody else. In a country like Morocco, the electoral trend has been the opposite, because in fact the PJD has been able to increase its majority in terms of seats and in terms of share of the votes, because it was perceived to have performed reasonably okay between 2012 and 2016. So at the electoral level, there is a certain trend that I think tends to reward parties that are perceived to be governing well and punish parties that tend to be governed badly. Then the second way of looking at what is happening in terms of, let's say, religiosity versus secularity, then in civil society, I think it's where in this dynamics of activism is that where you see maybe more differences, but where you also see a lot of bridges being built and a lot of kind of coalitions being made, precisely because, as Fatima was saying, the important issues are others. That, we do not necessarily have to concentrate on identity politics. So identity politics is important, but it's not the only thing out there. So I can go out and protest, and my protests go beyond the sect and go beyond my, let's say, level of religiosity or absence of religiosity. So you can see it in these two ways. Obviously, issues linked to identity are still quite important, and we have a chapter on that that looks specifically at Tunisia, but it's not, as it seemed to be in the past, the beginning and the ending of every discussion. So that there's other stuff going on that I think the book tries to capture in that respect. I hope that answered the question, Mohammed.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. And a question now from Nicole Piche. Nicole, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you. I was wondering if the book touched upon the role of the wider international community, both positive and negative, in supporting and protecting these movements of change. And I'm thinking particularly about keeping space open for members of movements of change who are peaceful and who become persecuted and often become prisoners of conscience. I mean, we've seen that especially in Egypt.
Well, in Egypt, we had Amr Hamzawi talked about the difficulty of having solidarity between agents of change and the problem of divide because of ideological rift between, and the fact that this lack of solidarity opens a way for the return of autocracy. We don't have a special chapter on the role of international actors in supporting actors of change inside this country because of the focus of giving way to actual national voices and how they see the struggle themselves. But I think in many chapters, in the chapter on Egypt, on the chapter on the civil society, we tackle this issue of national and international solidarity, and the fact of the lack of this solidarity opens the door for this level of repression that Egypt now represents the worst of it. I'm not sure, Francesco.
Yeah, no, we don't have a specific chapter, if you want, on the international dimension of all of this. There's the chapter by Hamzawi, of course, touches on this absence of national and international solidarity. There's one among the microdynamics and the dynamics of let's say activism that we looked at in the book. We included violence. So there is a chapter on Libyan militias. And in that particular chapter, then the author, Amir Kamel of King's College, he looks at the international aspect of that as well, of course, which is particularly relevant for Libya. But there is no chapter per se on the international community, in part because we wanted to kind of focus maybe more on what we call kind of local dynamics. I understand that it cannot necessarily be separated from international ones, and there's linkages between the two. But maybe that's a good idea to pursue for the next book.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. A question now from Aus Laban. Aus, are you there?
Hi, I'm here. Sorry. The question is for both of you, and might not be linked obviously to the book directly. But what do you think will be the impact of COVID, especially on the economic downturn? Now, mainly on Tunisia. We've been talking about Tunisia a lot. So on Tunisia and maybe the other part of the world, do you think will be a second wave of Arab Spring happening?
Well, I don't think that we were, before COVID, we were witnessing a second wave already in 4 countries. And in at least 2 of these countries, the movement continued somehow. Now it was disrupted by it, but it was not stopped by it. Whether it will trigger more, yes, most probably, because also the economic and financial situation will worsen, definitely. And what is also worsening is the repression. So we are witnessing incredible level of repression. Sisi upgraded the emergency law to give himself more power recently. The control of media, institutional media, became even more strong by system blocking of websites and so on. But I mean, this was also the aim of the book, is to show that when the international coverage of these movements, it's giving certain message that things are now calming down, no one is in street, nothing is happening. Many things were actively actually happening. And again, under COVID, the situation worsened, and new forms of dissent are also there. I mean, we have examples from Lebanon, from Algeria, even from Iraq, under extreme level of violence. These expressions are still there. What do you think, Francesco?
I agree. I mean, I don't have that much to add. Of course, I think that the economic consequences of lockdowns will become kind of clear, I suppose, in the next few weeks and months for everybody, not only for countries in the Arab world, but also for countries elsewhere. The public finances have exploded. I suppose the deficit will have exploded. Someone at some stage will have to pay for it. But we know who's going to pay for it, but that's a different story. And I think for the Arab world, it is going to be probably quite similar, and the effects will be quite tragic. And if I'm not mistaken, in Tunisia already people are out protesting that they have kind of nothing to eat because they can't go to work and so on. Lebanon is the same. So obviously it will be worse. It will compound the problems that already exist. The problem, as usual, will be how to turn these protests and into meaningful institutional change. Because I mean, the fact that we're looking at kind of activism, acts of citizenship, and so on, does not mean that the institutions are not important. I mean, we're not looking at institutions because a lot of people are looking at institutions, but that does not mean that the institutions are not important. And we will see what the reaction of governments, for instance, will be as well if the protests start again on the same scale as they were before the coronavirus lockdown.
And not to forget the situation, the human rights situations, the situation in prisons. I mean, we have a horrible situation in Arab prisons. I mean, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and so on. The situation is catastrophic, and it's worsening with COVID, and regimes are responding by actually additional pressure and repression, and we saw the news of deaths and coming from Egyptian prison, and lack of response by providing basic health care in this situation. So I think all the elements for an explosion, a new wave of dissent are there, but how and what kind of form it will take, and this is remain to be answered.
Thank you both very much. Now a question from Gareth Smythe. Gareth, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you now.
Yeah, I was a bit taken aback by what Francesco was saying, although he kind of slightly reversed just now. But in your substantial talk, I was a bit taken aback by your notion that there was something progressive or desirable in people turning away from institutions. It strikes me that effective citizenship requires robust institutions, and indeed, part of the Middle Eastern malaise over a long period of time is weak institutions, and that part of what Middle East protests have been about has been lack of redress, lack of effective institutions.
Yeah, no, apologies. I probably misspoke. I'm really sorry. I at a kind of as a scholar, but also as a citizen, I do believe actually institutions are quite important, very important. I was just saying that unfortunately, what the trend seems to be, and what the survey data indicate, and what all the surveys suggest, from the Arab Barometer to the Arab Transformations Project to others that have come out more recently, that unfortunately citizens do not believe in institutions. They have very little confidence. I'm not saying that that is a good thing. Absolutely not. In fact, it's a terrible thing. They don't have any trust in institutions. We wanted to try to capture that in a way. Precisely the absence of this transmission belt between citizens and institutions, because obviously strong active citizens, probably want strong and make strong institutions that then in return can provide exactly what you describe as kind of effectiveness and efficiency and legitimacy. Unfortunately, what I think the data are demonstrating, and the chapters in the book, a lot of the chapters in the book demonstrate, is that there is no trust whatsoever in these kind of institutions. And those who have adopted the kind of protest as politics have yet to figure out how to channel their activism in workable institutions. And I think that's where the dilemma is. So I'm sorry, Gareth, if I misspoke. Maybe this clarifies what I was trying to say.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you.
I just want to add that we never said that institutions are not important. I said that this focus on change only by what's going on in institutions is not enough to understand the change. If based on what Francesco said, if you see how little trust is in the Arab world in institutions, including the institution of media. I mean, traditional media, how it's manipulated by the power in place, and then this explains the focus of the book to try, and also the fact that citizenship is not necessarily built through institutions, and we see the role of civil society in Tunisia in protecting the democratic change. We see against the movement in Lebanon, it's against the institutional corruption, but it's not against the institution. It's not aiming to destroy the institution, but to reform them or to build something new. So there's not anti-institution kind of focus, but rather to say that the institution, how they are now, are being rejected by people.
Well, I'll just make a brief comment. I think it's important to recognize that street protests by activists, who by definition are not representative, don't in themselves create effective institutions. And I'm a little bit also concerned about talking about the mainstream media and speaking so positively of social media, which is something which is very easily manipulated. I mean, I don't think Lebanon, you mentioned Lebanon. I don't think Lebanon is a better place for the demise of Asafir or of Anahar and its replacement by the kind of people that are operating on social media.
We never praise social media at all, but at the contrary, I mean, the research project is focused on legacy media, and we are trying to see how media is impacting this movement of change. So I don't think in any way we praise social media. At the contrary, we say that the extensive focus on social media as a magic ball for change, just we realize that it's not realistic and it's not relevant anymore.
Thank you very much. And a question now from Jeff Ghannam. Jeff, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. Terrific segue from Fatima's comment just a moment ago with regard to legacy media and digital and social. I've done a fair amount of research for the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C. in regard to the early days, 2010, 2011, 2012, as to social media and its role. And it was very complex, just to say it mildly. But I'm wondering, in your research, have you found further, what can you tell us further, building on your comment just a moment ago with regard to digital and social media and its lack of effect or its role in the dynamic of online, offline protests and amplifying protests these days to the degree it does? Thank you.
well, I think we cannot talk anymore in a logic of divide between traditional media and social media, because the whole communication sphere is defined now by hybridity and uncertainty, and the exchange between the two is very much ongoing. The research I did myself was focused on traditional journalists, institutional journalists, how they perceive themselves, rather how they defined, do they see themselves as activists, as representative of political party, leader of public opinion, reporter. So try to delve into the complexity of perception and identity, and how this impact how they deal and how they communicate these struggles. And the finding of the research that this swinging between, I mean, their impact is very much ambivalent, because they tend to act in the same time, depending on different circumstances, both supporting a democratic change and hindering it and stopping it at the same time. So this ambivalence in their identity and how they see themselves has an ambivalent repercussion on the process. And it was very much overlooked by research that focused on institutional politics, mainstream politics, and on social media. But we cannot divide the two. So if you look, for example, in the region now, if you look where we can see alternative narrative in media, it's less in mass media, wealthy, supported, owned by wealthy businessmen or the state, but rather small voices of change that are very much individual projects. They are challenging taboos, tackling topics that used not to be tackled before. So what kind of impact they have, this is another question, because these are also leading to more fragmentation in the media space, that they have voice and their voices are strong. They are at the same time elitist, so their impact on the wider public is still to be really understood. But they are bringing change, they are bringing new narratives, new dynamics, and impacting also on mainstream media. So I think we need to look at the situation as really under hybridity and pluralism and diversity, rather than social media against mainstream media.
If I may, just very quickly, because I think there's another aspect to Jeff's question that he didn't mention when he spoke, but I think you can see it in the chat. It's the linkage with authoritarianism and authoritarian repression, and I think he is quite correct in the sense that the medium itself might not be as important, because the state will monitor whatever it wants to monitor and then punish swiftly, usually, those who speak up. And I think this emerges quite clearly in one of the chapters, the one on Morocco, on the Reef movement, whereby the leading or the leaders of the protest used social media quite a bit to call people to the streets and to make this connection online, offline. But there's two elements of it that are interesting. One is that the online mobilization works only if they have extensive real networks offline. So, you have to already have networks in place that are usually social networks in real life, rather than simply using the social media as a call to arms. And the other aspect is that the state is very well aware of this, and therefore will repress quite swiftly if it thinks that repression is the way to go. And in the case of Morocco, it was the way to go, and they repressed the movement, they jailed the leaders, they gave them very long prison sentences. And in a way, for a short period of time, they seem to have achieved their objective. What this cycle of repression does, I think, it simply postpones the inevitable showdown, because you go from one showdown to the next, in a way, and that's actually kind of the trap that these countries are into at the moment. So you repress in the name of stability, but stability is actually not really stable because you haven't removed the conditions for which protests were taking place in the first place. And so the idea is that is why I think we have to see the Arab uprising in a very kind of long wave, is that unless the conditions are somehow addressed of why there were protests in the first place, you are not going to see the stability you crave for, no matter how repressive these regimes might be, precisely because activist protest movements are quite able at the moment to pop up, regenerate, use new methods of actions, use new connections, maybe use new media and so on to keep going in a way.
And the use of graffiti, as an example. You know, if you walk in streets of Beirut and see the graffiti everywhere, you see that there is a shift back from social media to street art. These movements are innovative and are using all forms of media, social media, mainstream when they can, art, street art, and so on.
Thank you very much for those responses. Just one comment in the chat from Tarek. I think grassroots media in Lebanon and social media such as Megaphone and more have proved that mainstream media can't be trusted in covering mass anti-government protests in the country where politically backed and funded media skew the news, as we've seen several times. I don't know if there's any comment from that, Tarek, or
Megaphone are doing a great work, and yes, I mean, Lebanese media first covered and suddenly stopped to cover and then covering. So there is this close relationship between Lebanese media, their ownership, political parties, the clientelist system that very, very much decide who covers what and so on. And I'm very fond of Megaphone. I follow them. And other than Megaphone, we have, Daraj, we have other, kind of, this is the question of impact on the larger audiences that is at stake and how much impact they have on the larger public.
That's what actually I wanted to because I asked the question, I just wanted to ask, how much of an impact can these media institutions that are more trustworthy in the sense of challenging the higher, more politically backed institutions and media channels? I just wanted to see what is the impact then on these communities that are on the fringe, that are located in very, very far areas from the capital, from hubs, who have very bad quality internet and such. So how do these, like Akhbar al-Saha and Daraj, like you said,
exactly. I mean, you need first to have internet and access to smartphone or so on, and sometimes the things that we are preaching, they're convinced that they are talking to an audience that are already supporting them. And recently in September, a meeting took place in Beirut, facilitated by NAD, National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, that actually brought these voices and start thinking about whether we need a project of platform of solidarity to bring them together to maximize their impact. And the fact that also they need to impact on mainstream media. They need to have access to mainstream media, even in the current situation of co-optation, in order to also maximize or to expand their impact on people who usually watch TV but not necessarily read Megaphone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just one final question, I think, from Mohsen. Mohsen, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi, everyone. It is clear now that there are some regimes in the region and outside of the region who fear the Arab Spring and think it's an existential threat in some cases, and it's a political threat to some other nations as well. To what extent have you picked that up in your studies? Thank you.
Well, there's very little to disagree with in terms of the Arab uprisings being a threat to the regimes and having been a threat to the regimes for the last decade or so, I think the chapters that most highlight that in our book is the one about Syria, where obviously the author Salam Kawakibi examines the response of the Syrian regime to the protests. Obviously, he links it to the historical formation of the regime itself, but it goes into the details of what has actually occurred and the way in which the protests were framed by the regime. It emerges quite clearly in the chapter on Morocco, where in fact the protests that happened in 2011 are linked to the protests that occurred 5-6 years later in the Rif as a challenge, not necessarily as a challenge to the monarchy itself, but certainly as a challenge to the policies that the monarchy has contributed to implement, and a challenge to its executive role, rather than that executive role being left to elected representatives. It certainly emerges in the case of Algeria, where in fact the author was quite brilliant in capturing the 2019 moment as a real threat to the existence of this network of people in power that no one actually really knows that well, and that extends beyond Bouteflika and his brother Said. So the idea is that there is no doubt that in certain countries the regimes have acted and operated by taking into consideration the fact that these protests, no matter how local they might be, as in case of the Rif, could pose an existential threat to the regime. What we try to examine as well, though, is how these movements have been able to kind of survive one way or another and to continue challenge these regimes. In some cases, they have had a modicum of success. In other cases, they have not had much success. But they do represent in a way, they are the demonstration that there is something more problematic that these regimes and these governments in power have to deal with. It is not only that they have to deal with the protest movement, is that the protest movement represents a much larger challenge. And that challenge might not necessarily be into the streets. So not that everyone in Morocco or in Algeria goes out into the streets, but it certainly gives an indication of how poorly regimes are performing, particularly from an institutional point of view. And so I think Gareth is correct in terms of effectiveness of policy making and so on, and how badly they're performing in terms of socioeconomic equality, for lack of a better word.
I think I just would add that it created a culture of rights and this temptation to challenge and to ask for rights and to be active in trying to have them back or to ask for them. And I don't think that regime would be successful in repressing this culture or in eradicating it and going back to what used to be before this movement.
Thank you both for your very comprehensive answers to a lot of these questions, and also your initial talks. We're very grateful to both of you for speaking with us today. As mentioned before, the book is available to purchase, which with the 30% off. I mean, if Claire perhaps from Gingko would perhaps put any link or the email address to which to contact if you want to purchase this. And also, as a reminder, it's great to see so many new faces that are sort of perhaps you're hearing about Caabu for the first time, or perhaps you're hearing about our events for the first time, or perhaps you've been coming to our events for 50, 60 years. Actually, not 60, we're not that old. But we're very grateful to you for doing that. And if you do want to keep in touch, and then please make sure you sign up to our mailing list to hear about future events. And also, we have next week, we have an event with Hanan Ashwari on Tuesday. And then the following week, we have an event on Yemen and the coronavirus. And we'll be doing more and more of these events. So do sort of keep up to date with what we're doing. And also, if you can support us in these times, as always, why not become a member of Caabu, and also help us out if in any way you can. But thank you all for joining, and thank you so much to Fatima and to Francesco, and hope everyone stays safe and keeps well.